Gave our retreat crew instructions to make a tape for the craft. Since when they were here talking to us, they attempted to make a tape, but for whatever reason the tape didn't come out. So they gave us an instruction to try and reconstruct it and go over the things that they went over with us for the rest of the class. The first question that came up was Stan Odie. He asked if the links had mentioned in the past about the possibility of Church of Genetic Improvement, would it be appropriate to use the terms Church of Genetic Improvement when writing the lesson segments?
Well, I could be wrong, but what I understood Link to say was that you wouldn't refer to the church or to any of the premises that they gave as to what the church believes. You wouldn't refer to anything except just the genetic basics that they gave us and things that we've been taught in the class. You wouldn't refer to anything outside that.
Well, I think the basic point was to not present any religious connotation at all. That compute to humans like you're trying to lay a trip on them and trying to tell them how to improve, and they can't help but be turned off by that. I think that the terminology that they were using, that Church of Genetic Improvement, was basically for us, for them to relate it to us, but they didn't want us to include any of that terminology in the segments themselves for fear that it would be have too much of a religious connotation to it, and they also wanted to avoid even any philosophical type of connotation to the segments. And that's when they went into trying to get across to us how they would like us to write our segments. Eventually we wanted to get to the point where our segments are interesting and exciting and stimulating. He said that some writers have a knack for writing one sentence, and as soon as you read that sentence, you can't wait to get to the next sentence. And continuous stimulation to want to get through the whole thing, and they don't want us to just write something intellectually or something that's real dry that the only people that would read it would be people that would read anything. They wanted us to exert the effort to write our lesson segments in a way that would be stimulating and interesting for someone to read, not just have factual information, but actually be exciting, and that if we wrote a lesson segment that basically just had the information in it, we could go back over it and try and make it more exciting to write. They know that some of us might not feel like we have a flair for that stylistic writing or something like that, but they would like for us to try and make it interesting, just so it's not boring for someone to read.
I may be wrong, but I think it said that they did kind of want us to write it so that it would appeal to them intellectually without being intellectual. That's not a paradox.
Another thing that Links discussed with us, I could be wrong, but they're speaking about how they would write segments, making them interesting, and they said that they would, Bill said he would go with the flow of how the words came to him in his thinking. He found it lent an artificiality to go to a book such as the Thesaurus or dictionary to find extra words or special words to express what he wanted to express. He would simply put down what words came to him and maybe rearrange them later, review them to make them more interesting. He said he didn't seem like we have to be concerned with spelling or using these books while we wrote, since these papers, when they were typed, if they were typed, would be edited and the spelling corrected at that time.
another thing Rick talked about was how we affect others in changing our genetic programming, and they used my class situation as an example, and Doug gave an analogy of a bushel of apples, and there's one bad apple in the bushel, and it doesn't have, that one bad apple doesn't have to make the other apples bad.
If we could just back up for a second, when I started talking about the bad apple thing, it came up when the question was asked what we can say in our segments that would appeal, how we would appeal to the humans in order to get them to be interested in reading the segment. And they mentioned that we're appealing to the people who mainly want to have a desire to want to upgrade, who want to find a way to improve their lives or to change, but there's maybe some that may not look at it that way as far as changing themselves, but they may look at how rotten the world is out there, and we could appeal to them through that avenue by saying the world's rotten and how you can help it become less rotten by changing your genetic programming, and through that avenue the individual may eventually turn around and start examining their own actions and seeing how they can improve themselves in order to turn around and help the world.
And as I said, that the way that those individuals or those apples can change their genetic programming so that they are not affected by the rotten apples. They're not. They don't acquire the bad qualities of the bad apple just by not seeing, doing whatever you can to not see the rottenness of that apple, not accept it, not even let it register in your brain. It doesn't do any good to just restrain, or sling in the mud back at the bad apple. It has to go further than that by cutting off the thought of even registering that bad apple is throwing mud at me.
Human programming or human way of thinking is there's two ways that they can respond when somebody's when the bad apple is speaking to the good apple. Is that one, the person could either walk away, or two, he can fight back, and both of those are wrong because they're both seeing that other person as being the bad apple or coming from the wrong place or being upset or out of sorts. And what they need to learn, and the way we've been taught, is to not accept the thought or accept seeing that person as being that way. And that's the whole key to the reprogramming in that area, is to not permit yourself to see that person as coming across that way. And a human could think, he gave an example of something like, we wouldn't have having this problem or something if this person wasn't being irritated or something like that.
And by refusing to see that individual as a bad apple or doing something bad, then we're helping that individual by not accepting his, the genetic programming he might be trying to express.
Another point they made also was that this is protecting yourself by not seeing the individual, but this is protecting your own vibrations by not having the thought that this individual did something wrong. And
in other words,
right.
if you
you're accepting the poison is what you're doing, because if the person is coming across that way and you accept what they're saying as the way you're saying it, you're accepting your own poison into your own system and
reinforcing the other chain. there's negative genes in your own house.
And we have to just not see it that way, and we have to try and explain it.
One of the keys, could be wrong, but I think that one of the keys that they were trying to get across was that at all costs that we would not allow ourselves, our own vibrations, to be affected by anything that anyone else does or any response that someone might have, and that we'd always remain in a good place, and that by just remaining in that way and not allowing any negativity even to register, eventually, so if someone was having a bad response or whatever and they couldn't get anything bounced back, or it wouldn't initiate another response from you, then eventually they would have no avenue to let that bad response out any longer, and eventually that would even dissipate. So that not only to be accomplishing two things by not allowing yourself to be affected, you'd actually be helping that other person as well.
They use the analogy of the barrel of apples to illustrate what Sarah just said, and they said that if you have the barrel of apples and there was one bad one, that if the other apples didn't allow themselves to be affected by the bad apple and protected their vibration, that eventually the bad apple, having nothing else to do, would have to come around.
I think Stan Modi asked another question. If an individual is crippled or deformed in some way, and is that inherited? And I don't know if you finished this question, but the links explain that just because an individual is crippled or deformed doesn't necessarily mean that a genetic inheritance. It could have been a disease he acquired when he was like polio, or he fell out of a tree, and the genes that resulted in him being crippled might have been the genes that made him climb the tree or susceptible to a disease. Then they went into how we inherit genes and how genes don't necessarily disappear.
That's like the alcoholic.
Yeah, someone wrote in your segment.
Somebody said in your segment that you're an alcoholic, something about you're an alcoholic.
He's born an alcoholic.
Born an alcoholic, and you're not born an alcoholic. You're born with the weakness, the genes that have a weakness for alcoholism, but they're not. It doesn't become expressed or obvious, manifested until the first time the vehicle is confronted with that weakness, and how that individual responds to that weakness according to his gene determines whether he heads in the direction of giving into the weakness or trying to stay away from it. And they also then talked about the starts with P, promiscuity, about how several generations ago promiscuity, individuals at that time had those thoughts, but they weren't putting those thoughts into physical action. But they because the society at that time condoned those kind of actions.
Did not
condone. But they may have had those thoughts, but they got passed down to the next generation, and to where we are now, where this society trends to just kind of go ahead and, if it feels good, do it, type thing, and do whatever you think you're thinking or whatever, and so those thoughts of promiscuity are manifested into physical, and people are just participating in what was the weaknesses that were passed down, even though the trend is good.
I think the point here, it seems to me, I might be wrong, but the point here was that even though maybe the ancestors had this weakness in promiscuity and did not exercise it because at that time they were living in an era where promiscuity was looked upon harshly, that if they still felt the desire to do it but only restrained from it because of society, the genes are still passed down as a weakness, and when it is passed down to the generation that promiscuity at that time was no longer something to be concerned about, that they went ahead and went into it physically, and they didn't restrain. So, in other words, that weakness came down in their genes, and they had the opportunity then to overcome it, but they didn't because promiscuity was in at that time.
Talk about the only way that genes are programmed or corrected. Say, for example, promiscuity. Back several generations ago, people cut off the thought. They had stopped the thought when those thoughts came into their minds, and they, instead of entertaining them, which just reinforced the genes, if they had cut out those thoughts, and that occurred all the way to generation to generation. After several generations, that weakness would become almost nil because it had been nipped in the bud for so long it would have been almost wiped out.
And this is what, and Lynx was mentioning that this is what Jesus meant when he said that if you had the thought, you might as well have done it, because as far as genetics are concerned, you haven't changed your genes, you haven't reprogrammed them if you haven't gotten rid of the thought as well as the act.
I guess I think at this point that again says, but we can't tell anybody in our sermons that Jesus says this or this is what Jesus meant, because again that would immediately put it in the category of a religious preach.
They said that humans cannot take what Jesus said without putting it automatically up on some religiosity or some sort of pedestal or something, and so there's no way that you can use any of that teachings that he had. But we can see, and Lynx can see, what he was saying with what they're talking about.
I think at this point is when they said something to the effect they'd wish we could write it so that it would appeal to the intellect without sounding intellectual.
I think another question about the sun was one that Vasudi asked, and he asked, can you give me some help on giving humans motivation in that sector? Why do they want to change their genetics in this way? And we said, because they are slaves to the trends, they're slaves to their everything that goes on in society, whether what you smoke or what drugs you use, what you eat,
They're slaves to their trends from the time they get up in the morning until the time they get up the next morning, because everything they do is controlled by the trends that are set, and those trends change every several years, right?
Not only that, but they accept these trends as the norm.
And they're trapped in them, and they don't really have any free will.
Even though they're the ones who think that they are the ones that are free and free to have choices, they're the ones that are not free at all, because they're tied to every trend that they're caught up in.
In other words, their motivation is to be free, and they're just the opposite of free. So if we can explain this to them, they still have the motivation, like they do want to be free. They want to lead their own lives. They don't want to just be slaves. So if we can explain to them that how to do that, there's their motivation.
And they even mentioned how some of us are getting a little older, that how we could see how some of the trends that affected us when we were younger, and like in your adolescent years are more susceptible to the trends of, and how being more removed from that now, we can see what trends affected us at those times.
And we look down at the generation that's younger than us, and we already start to be amazed that they can be into the trends and the hipness that they're into, but we were the same way, and if anything, it's getting worse, like it's getting progressively a stronger influence.
And then from there they went into, suppose that there's like a family, let's say there's a family living in Alaska, and that they're say there was a family living in Alaska, and they were, let's say, supposedly closed off from society or the trends of society, but they actually had their own trends within their little family unit. And let's say they got into arguing or whatever, then they would have like the little genetic trends or habits within their family unit that they would need to get past. And at this point, Links even suggested that someone might choose to write a segment about how the family could change their genetics as a group and work on it together, and even have like little family talks, which kind of would resemble like our help wanted meetings, and helping each other to see their weak areas and how they could change their genetics and reprogram themselves so that they could get past what their weak areas were. So, like, let's say that as a family they were realizing that they were arguing constantly or were not understanding each other, then they could decide as a unit that they wanted to get past that and sit down together and go over how they would want to work on that.
There's a couple other points to that they mentioned. It's like if there's a family, this family who lives out homesteading or something out in the boondocks, and their household is kind of unpleasant, and they argue a lot, or they shout at each other a lot, and they have children, and those children are raised in that household with that kind of conduct. But those children are going to act the same way.
And assume that's how they're supposed to act.
Assume that's how they're supposed to act, because they don't know any better. And a lot of times, Links mentioned that children who are raised in that kind of environment won't listen to their parents unless their parents talk loud and forceful to them. And if their parents talk nice to them, they just ignore them.
Or they think that they're buttering them up for some reason.
Seems to me, I think one of the points they made by using the family that lived in Alaska was that they were segregated from the other community, and they wouldn't be affected by the trends like those in the city. But even still, if they were that isolated, they would still have things that they could work on, and that's when they went into like their family structure, how they could work on the family problems.
Right. It's in the genetic programming to express a certain trend at a certain time.
And you're talking about that if this family is out there, what they'd have to do, or what we could explain, is that they would have to all decide as a unit to be nice to each other and to drop their defenses. And it's like what Links had us do years ago in campgrounds when we first started out, and we said that in order for us to kind of all play the game right, we have to promise ourselves that we drop our defenses and not
it wouldn't work for just one individual to drop all the defenses, because then they would be vulnerable and they would be sensitive and could be hurt easily if someone else was aggressive or hadn't dropped their defenses. So the only way it would work is if everybody
agrees to do that.
They said that I could be wrong, I think they said that the defenses, a lot of the defenses are actually genetic, like they're ways of protecting the genes, or what we used to call the vehicle. And these, if the whole group determines that they will drop these, then it's like they're all saying, okay, we don't accept these genes. So they're, in essence, they're actually reprogramming. Whereas if only one or two people do it, it's going to take a very long time to have any effect, if at all, because the other people still accept the genes that they have. They don't see that these people, they haven't made an agreement all to do it, and therefore they haven't really seen that the genes are something they don't want.
There's something about it. Before we use the word influences, and now we're using genes, but the similarity is the same.
That's what they were. At one time they were calling them influences, but let's say more truthfully, ours, what they were, is just our genes, the defense mechanism built into the genes. And at this point, I think they start telling us about the doctor story.
Right. Well, I think that tied into how we could help humans see how they could improve and how they act towards one another. And she started to explain. She saw a TV show once about a doctor story, and there were 4 characters, main characters.
Chief of staff, and then there was some of the other people who worked, and then who were all like the regulars on the show. And then there was a guest on the show who was another doctor who came in. And this guest doctor wanted the chief of staff doctor's position. So he went around and to the other regular members of his doctor's staff and individually said things in a sort of a subtle way, in a way that he couldn't really be quoted, but implied or made connotations that the chief of staff doctor had made references about his staff that would be putting them down, or critical, or being incompetent, or something like that. And he went around to all the staff and tried to get them to turn against the chief of staff doctor. And the staff would come up to the chief of staff doctor and say things to him that would something like that. I want you to know, doctor, that nurses here aren't slaves, or something like that. And he would just be totally caught off guard and didn't understand what was going on, and he would say something like, "Well, I guess it's the full moon," or something.
I think the point here is that the chief of staff doctor was taking the higher side. He was responding in the right way. He was responding in the right way to the staff coming to him saying negative things, assuming that it was just something they were going through that would pass. He wasn't even, it didn't even enter his mind that something was, what is it called?
Right.
Well, he not only didn't answer.
Conspiracy was being set up to get him out.
But he not only didn't answer negatively back to them, but he didn't even think negatively. In other words, he didn't accept the genes that the other doctor had triggered in these people. Like, he didn't accept the negativity at all. He just saw that, well, there must be some kind of problem, or like the full moon or something, but he just didn't respond at all mentally or vocally to it.
So eventually the board of directors got together and they were going to fire the chief of staff doctor, and let this other guest doctor become the chief of staff when somehow the chief of staff doctor realized something, and somehow there was another hospital position that was even better than his position, in which you made referred the guest doctor as being very qualified for the position, and he ended up taking that position, and then the regular staff began comparing notes and realized that this guest doctor was actually conspiring them to go against their friend. And there's this kind of ties into something else that also they're talking about how somebody who responds like that a person, a very wise person doesn't respond in like kind when someone is angry or hostile to somebody. He thinks something like, gosh, maybe it's just something nutritional this person's dealing with. Or, I wish there was a vitamin or something I could slip in their mouth that could help them with this deficiency or something that they a wise
I'd be taking it this way.
wise person is taking the higher side and seeing it more objectively and not allowing his vehicle or his genes to respond to that kind of programming.
Well, he explained that this was just like a TV show, and she felt like it was a very good lesson in hopes that the humans would recognize that, and that she knew that it was just the writer that maybe had pulled in those thoughts. But the point was they wanted us to try to convey this kind of conduct to the humans in our segment, show them how they can respond, because they don't know how to handle situations. They don't know how to handle it when someone comes to them and is mean and nasty to them. The only thing they know how to do is either throw mud back or respond poorly or walk away, and then they continue on with their programming. But just getting back to the doctor's story, they felt like, unfortunately, at the end it had a negative twist to it, because the chief of staff doctor, once he realized there was a conspiracy to oust him, he made
phone call
to
the guest doctor saying we could use your position and give you a penthouse and a chauffeur,
and then the guest doctor drove all the way to Washington just only to find a hospital being demolished, and he was nothing. And unfortunately, that, I guess, the human writer got to this point and didn't know how else to get.
And in Link's opinion, the chief doctor, by doing that, was being as bad as the guest doctor who wanted his position in the first place.
The important point is they just kind of gave that as a little extra point of the story, I think, was that how the doctor conducted himself when he was hit with this barrage of negativity from all of his staff that were before that kind and friendly toward him, and that he just reacted in a way that was conduct that we've been taught to try to have.
So this is getting back to like the family situation. Link, when they suggested that it would be an excellent segment to write about how a family could work together to improve their situation, they said that we could use our personal experiences, like when our vehicles were younger. Just don't use any names, and it's even okay to make up a story, to put it into that frame of mind or that line of thinking to make it realistic, to make it effective.
In other words, they were saying you can use your actual, real, first-hand family experiences if you want to in a segment, but don't use any of the real names of the family or anything like that.
It showed that I believe what they were saying was, with this experience, you can show the human how to react in the correct way, so that it's sort of an example of how to bring the conduct up. So, is that correct?
The circumstance you may have been in, you didn't handle it right, and you know how to handle it right now, so you can know how to handle it.
So in it, what I understood was that you could go back to a real situation or a make-believe situation and use what you have now and just recreate the whole thing, but this time do it as you would do it, what you were taught now. Do it correctly. How would you resolve it according to what we've been taught?
Speaking of resolving, they were talking about the outline. Have we gotten to that?
I think Sam Odie asked another question about is it appropriate? He mentioned that he's writing a segment and he's finding as his introduction explaining what genetics are. It's getting to be 3 or 4 pages long, and he wanted to know if it's Link's intention to write an introduction to each one of the segments.
Yeah. It was sort of the question I had in my mind was that did we want to introduce all of them with that lengthy a description of genetics? And I could be wrong, but what they said was that to see that we understand it, they would like us to make the first one that we write, all of us, in other words, to make the first one that we write have a complete understanding of genetics as an introduction. But after that, we could streamline it and just put down a few basics that would be a lead-in to explain why one would do the segment, why it makes sense, and why it relates to genetics.
The links to the thing, they feel it's real important that they have to know that we have got these lessons in the right place. They have to know that we've learned what they taught us, and this is a good way of showing them that we do understand what they're telling us.
Then they went through a little outline of what we could use for how to write our statements. And they said that it could start off with an introduction, and then we could give a clarification, and we could give the statement, and then the solution.
And the point I think that Sam Odie was making, I think that Links was saying, was that they want to know that we understand the lesson that we're getting about how genetics affect us. Not necessarily that you had to have 4 or 5 pages saying that, but they want whatever you write to write in a way so that it's complete enough so they can see whether or not you understand what the lesson about genetics is.
They did mention that they had received some segments that aren't complete. It's like they don't give the solution, or they explain it pretty well, but they don't finish it up, tie it up.
And then the question was asked about the length of the segment, and Links said that you really didn't want it to be too long, but if you needed a certain amount of space in order to get the whole thought and the whole picture out clear, that it would be better to make it too long than too short. But they thought there wouldn't be anything wrong with it. If you felt your segment was too long right after you finished it, you could go back and see how you could condense it in certain ways. And some people felt like they were writing, 10 or 12 pages or something like that on a computer paper, but Link said that it really depended on what size your handwriting was, what size the paper was that you were using, and that they really didn't show like that they were that concerned about the length of it, except they didn't want too much of an extreme being gone through.
Especially since when length typed up, it's reduced to 2 or 3 pages.
They did make, I believe, reference to a couple of classmates' segment and said that the way they had written it, that 3 or 4 or 5 sheets were not too long, but even then, maybe when it's typed, it's condensed also.
They also did mention that if we would go to as far as getting the segments published, that in their opinion, none of the segments that were prepared yet were acceptable enough for publishing, and that so we could work on getting them into a more polished state for that.
I just wanted to back up a little bit to a point that Sam Odie had brought up about where Links had mentioned that some of the segments were seemed to be stopping in midway or something like that. What I think Links had meant was that some of the segments the writers were assuming the readers would assume too much or know too much, and we need to make sure we exert enough effort to spell out everything very clearly, and not assume that the reader can assume that the reader would know anything. And from that point of view, it's then okay to go ahead and write your segments as long as you feel you need to, and then go back later, and then you can see how you can cut out extra words.